The Vigil of Shadows. In a kingdom that remembered its wars more clearly than its peace, Duke Adrian was known as the blade that never broke, the man who stood at the edge of chaos and forced it to kneel. And yet within the walls of his own estate, far from the banners and battlefields, he was something entirely different, something softer, something human, something only one person in the world was allowed to see. Lyra. Their third anniversary arrived quietly, not with grand celebration or courtly spectacle, but with something far more meaningful, a rare evening free from politics, from strategy, from the endless demands placed upon a man who carried the weight of a kingdom's stability on his shoulders. The dining hall was lit with low, golden candlelight, the shadows stretching long across the polished floor, and for once, there were no advisors waiting beyond the doors, no messengers lingering in the corridors, only the two of them seated across from one another in a silence that was not empty, but full. "You have been staring at me all evening," Lyra said lightly, though her eyes held warmth rather than accusation, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass as she studied him in return. Adrian allowed the faintest smile, one that rarely appeared outside of her presence, and even then, only in moments like this when the world seemed to loosen its grip on him. "I am committing the moment to memory," he replied, his voice low, steady, carrying that quiet gravity that had made men follow him into war without question. She tilted her head slightly, amused, though something in his tone made her pause. "That sounds far too serious for an anniversary," she said. "It is exactly as serious as it needs to be," he answered, though the softness in his gaze remained, anchoring the weight of his words. From within his coat, he withdrew a small object, delicate and intricately crafted, and placed it gently in her palm. A locket. Its surface was engraved with subtle patterns that caught the candlelight, and when she opened it, she found not a portrait, but an empty space, and beneath it, a hidden compartment she had not expected. Lyra looked up at him, curiosity replacing her earlier amusement. "There is nothing inside," she said. "Not yet," Adrian replied, his voice quieter now, more deliberate, as though each word had been chosen long before this moment arrived. "If the world ever grows dark, look for the light within." The phrase lingered between them, strange and poetic, and for a brief moment, something unsettled stirred in her chest, a feeling she could not quite name, but she dismissed it quickly, because Adrian had always been a man of layered meaning, of words that carried more than they revealed. "It is beautiful," she said instead, closing the locket gently and fastening it around her neck. "Thank you." He reached across the table then, his hand covering hers, the contact grounding, steady, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist entirely. But the world always returned. It came in the form of letters, black letters. They arrived the next morning, sealed in wax that bore no crest, no origin, no identity, only intent. Adrian read them alone in his study, the door closed, the fire burning low as his eyes moved across words that were not threats in the usual sense, but promises. "We will take what you protect." "We will break what you love. You cannot stand watch forever." His jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained otherwise unchanged, because men like Adrian did not react outwardly. They calculated, they adapted, they prepared. But this was different. These were not threats against his position, not challenges to his authority, but something far more precise. They were aimed at Lyra, at the one place he could not afford to be weak. The pattern became clear quickly. The timing, the phrasing, the knowledge of his movements, his routines, his defenses. This was not the work of distant rebels alone. This was someone closer. Someone who understood him. That night, long after the manor had fallen into silence, Adrian stood within the war room beneath the estate, a place few even knew existed, its walls lined with maps, its tables marked with the quiet remnants of strategy and conflict. Across from him stood his most loyal commander, a man who had followed him through battles that should have ended them both. "They are closing in," Adrian said, his voice low, controlled, his gaze fixed on the map before him. "Not on me, on her." The commander frowned slightly, his expression hardening. "Then we increase the guard, double the watch. No one gets within 100 paces without your approval." Adrian shook his head once, a small, decisive movement. "That is exactly what they want." He turned then, his gaze sharp, clear, already settled on a conclusion he had not yet spoken aloud. "As long as I stand in the light, they will aim for the shadow." "And Lyra? Is that shadow?" The realization hung heavy in the air, its implications immediate and unforgiving. "What are you saying?" the commander asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Adrian did not hesitate. "I cannot protect her as long as I am alive in their eyes." The words were simple, but their meaning was anything but. Silence followed, deep and absolute, as the weight of what he was proposing settled between them. "You are talking about becoming a ghost," the commander said finally. Adrian met his gaze without hesitation. "I am talking about ending this before it begins." The decision was made in that moment, not with emotion, not with hesitation, but with the same clarity that had guided him through every war he had ever fought. To save the heart of the kingdom, he would have to break his own. The final night came too quickly. The Last Supper, though Lyra did not know it as such, unfolded in a quiet echo of their anniversary, the same candlelight, the same stillness. But something had changed, something subtle yet undeniable. Adrian was gentler, his words fewer, his attention sharper, as though memorizing every detail he could not take with him. "You are quiet tonight," Lyra said softly, watching him in a way that suggested she felt the shift, even if she could not name it. "Just thinking," he replied, his voice steady, though something beneath it carried a weight she could not quite reach. "About what?" He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for a moment, everything he was about to do threatened to fracture under the simple reality of her presence. "About what matters," he said at last. The answer was not enough, but she did not press, because she trusted him completely, without question, and that trust was the very thing he was about to break. When the evening ended, when the candles burned low and the silence returned, Adrian walked her to her chambers as he always did, his presence steady beside her, familiar, safe. At the door, he paused, just for a moment, his hand lifting to brush a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that felt almost out of place for a man like him. "Rest well, Lyra," he said quietly. "You too?" she replied, smiling faintly, unaware that this was the last time she would speak to him as a living man. He leaned forward then, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, a gesture so simple, so familiar, and yet it carried everything he could not say. Goodbye. The word never left his lips, but it was there, and as he turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor, the man the kingdom knew as Duke Adrian walked toward his death, or rather, toward the illusion of it. The morning Adrian left did not feel like an ending, not to Lyra, not to the servants who watched him depart from the stone steps of the estate, not even to the guards who saluted as his carriage rolled forward beneath the pale light of dawn, because departures were a constant in a life bound to duty, and Adrian had left many times before, always returning, always unchanged, always steady as the force that defined him. He wore the same composed expression, the same controlled presence, offering Lyra a final glance that lingered just long enough to reassure without revealing anything beneath it. And when she lifted her hand in farewell, she did so with the quiet confidence of someone who had never had reason to doubt his return. The carriage moved swiftly once it passed through the gates, the horses well-trained, the driver experienced, the route familiar, a journey that should have been uneventful, predictable, safe. But the high pass bridge was not a place that forgave mistakes, and what happened there was not a mistake. Witnesses would later speak of it in fragments, voices shaken, eyes wide with disbelief, describing how the carriage had reached the midpoint of the bridge before something gave way. A sudden snap, a violent shift, the structure groaning under a force that had not been there moments before. The horses panicked, rearing as the front axle splintered, and within seconds, control was lost. The carriage tipped. For a heartbeat, it hung suspended between balance and ruin, and then it fell. The plunge into the Blackwater River below was not graceful, not quiet, but catastrophic. The impact shattering wood and iron alike, the current swallowing everything in its path as though it had been waiting, as though it had been prepared. By the time help arrived, there was nothing left to save. The river churned violently, its surface broken only by fragments of wreckage and the relentless pull of water that revealed nothing and returned even less. They searched for hours, then days, dragging the depths, combing the banks, calling out into a silence that gave no answer. No body was recovered, only his cloak. It was found caught on the jagged rocks further downstream, torn, soaked in darkened blood, the fabric unmistakable, the weight of it undeniable. The news reached the estate before the truth could fully settle, carried by riders who spoke in hushed tones, and their words careful yet heavy with finality. Lyra heard it in pieces at first, fragments of sentences that refused to form something complete, until finally the reality was spoken aloud, clear and unrelenting. The Duke is dead. The words did not make sense. Not immediately. They existed in a space separate from understanding, something distant, something unreal, and for a moment, Lyra simply stood there, her expression unchanged, her mind refusing to accept what it had just been given. "That is not possible," she said quietly, not in denial, but in certainty, because Adrian was not a man who could simply end. But certainty does not change truth. The days that followed blurred into something shapeless, something hollow, where time lost meaning and the world itself seemed to dim. Grief did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, the creeping into the spaces he had once filled until it became impossible to ignore. It was in the silence of his study, where the chair remained exactly as he had left it, the desk untouched, the maps still marked with strategies that would never be completed. It was in the faint scent of his tobacco clinging to the coats he would never wear again, fading day by day until even that small trace of him began to disappear. It was in the sound of footsteps in the corridor that she expected to be his, only to realize, again and again, that they never would be. The black veil came last. When they placed it in her hands, she stared at it for a long moment, the fabric light yet suffocating in its meaning, and when she finally draped it over her face, the world shifted into something distant, something muted, so as though she had been separated from it entirely. Widow. The word followed her without being spoken, carried in every glance, every bowed head, every careful silence that surrounded her. The estate changed with her grief, its halls quieter, heavier, the weight of loss settling into the very stone, as though even the manor itself understood that something essential had been taken from it. And then Voss arrived. Baron Voss did not enter the estate as an invader, but as family, his presence announced with solemn respect, his expression carefully arranged into one of grief that mirrored the expectations of the moment. He embraced Lyra when he saw her, his voice low, measured, carrying just enough sorrow to appear genuine without ever crossing into something real. "My dear sister," he said softly, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "I came as soon as I heard." Lyra did not respond immediately, not because she doubted his words, but because something within her remained too hollow to engage with them fully. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice distant, controlled, the weight of her loss pressing down on every syllable. Voss lingered only briefly in that moment, offering comfort in the way one might expect, but his true intentions revealed themselves not in what he said, but in what he did next. Within hours of his arrival, his men began to move. They took positions within the guard towers, their presence subtle but unmistakable, replacing familiar faces with those loyal not to the estate, but to him. Orders were given quietly, efficiently, reshaping the structure of power within the manor before anyone could question it. To the outside world, it was a necessary adjustment, a brother stepping in to protect what remained, to ensure stability in the wake of tragedy. But to those who watched closely, who understood the delicate balance Adrian had maintained, it was something else entirely. A shift, a takeover disguised as duty. Lyra noticed it, though her grief dulled its sharpness, her focus pulled constantly back to the absence that defined her every waking moment. Still, something about Voss unsettled her. Something beneath the surface of his careful composure. Something that did not align with the role he was playing. He remained close in the days that followed, offering guidance, support, assistance in managing the estate. Always present, always watching, his concern never quite reaching his eyes. "You should rest," he told her one evening, his tone gentle, persuasive, the kind of voice that suggested he knew what was best for her. "You have endured enough. Let me handle the burdens for now." Lyra met his gaze through the veil, her expression hidden, but her instincts stirring faintly beneath the grief. "And what burdens would those be?" she asked quietly. Voss smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "All of them." The answer lingered, its meaning deeper than the words themselves, and for the first time since Adrian's death, something sharp cut through the haze of her sorrow. Awareness. The world had not simply taken her husband, it had shifted around his absence, and though she did not yet know the full truth, though she did not yet see the shape of what was unfolding, she felt it. Something was wrong, and somewhere within the walls of the estate, hidden beneath stone and shadow, the man she mourned was not as gone as the world believed. He was watching, waiting, becoming something far more dangerous than the Duke they thought had died. Grief did not leave Lyra, it simply changed shape, settling into the quiet corners of her days, lingering in the spaces Adrian had once occupied, turning absence into something she carried rather than something that crushed her entirely. And yet beneath that sorrow, something else began to stir, something she could not explain, something that refused to align with the finality of death. It began with small things, so small she almost dismissed them as imagination. the fragile tricks of a mind unwilling to let go. The first was the tea. She had not called for it, had not even thought of it, and yet each morning, when she entered the small sitting room adjoining her chambers, a cup of her favorite blend sat waiting, steam rising faintly as though it had only just been poured. The servants, when questioned, denied any knowledge of it, their confusion genuine, their unease unmistakable. "It must be a mistake," one of them suggested, though her voice carried no conviction. But it was not a mistake. It happened again and again. Then there were the windows. She had taken to leaving one slightly open at night, a habit she had formed during Adrian's long absences, a way of letting the outside air in, a small defiance against the suffocating stillness of the manor. Yet each morning it was closed, latched firmly against the chill, the curtains drawn just enough to block the harshest light. At first she assumed a servant had taken it upon themselves to correct her oversight, but when she asked, they shook their heads, their discomfort growing with each question she posed. "We would not enter your chambers without permission, my lady," one insisted, her voice tight with unease. Lyra began to notice other things then. Subtle shifts. Objects moved slightly from where she had left them, not misplaced, not disturbed, but adjusted, as though someone had passed through her space with quiet intention. A book she had set aside would appear open to a specific page, a passage marked not with ink, but with placement, as though guiding her attention. The locket Adrian had given her, which she had once worn constantly, she found one evening resting on her bedside table, though she was certain she had left it within a drawer. She stood there for a long moment, staring at it, her pulse quickening, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling. Recognition. It was not the presence of a stranger she felt. It was familiar, heavy, steady, like the echo of someone who had never truly left. The realization did not come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. She was not alone. The turning point came in Adrian's study. She had avoided it at first, unable to face the stillness of a room that had once held so much life, but something drew her back there eventually, a need to understand, to find something, anything, that might anchor her in the shifting reality she now faced. The room remained exactly as it had been left, the desk untouched, the maps still marked with careful precision, the faint scent of tobacco lingering just enough to remind her of what had been lost. She moved through the space slowly, her fingers brushing lightly over the surface of the desk, her gaze tracing the familiar lines of a place she had rarely entered before his death, respecting the boundaries he had quietly maintained between his world and hers. It was the ledger that led her to it. She had been searching for it among the shelves, a simple task meant to distract her thoughts, when her hand pressed against a section of the wall that did not feel quite right. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible. A faint click that echoed softly through the silence, and before she could fully process what had happened, the bookshelf beside her moved. It did not creak or groan, but slid smoothly aside, revealing a narrow passage hidden behind it, its entrance dark, its purpose unmistakable. Lyra stared at it, her breath catching as the weight of discovery settled over her. Adrian had secrets. Not small ones, not harmless ones. This was something else entirely, something deliberate, something hidden for a reason. For a moment, she hesitated, her instincts pulling her in two directions at once, caution urging her to step back, to close the passage, to pretend she had never found it, while something deeper, something stronger, pushed her forward. The same instinct that had led her to question the impossible now refused to let her turn away, and so she stepped inside. The passage was narrow, the air cool and still, the stone walls close enough that her shoulders brushed against them as she moved forward, guided only by the faintest trace of light ahead. The silence here was different from the rest of the manor, deeper, more intentional, as though it had been designed to swallow sound entirely. She moved carefully, each step measured, her heartbeat loud in her ears, until the passage opened into a small chamber overlooking the great hall below. The view was concealed behind a narrow slit in the stone, allowing a clear line of sight without revealing the presence of anyone within. A vantage point, a place for observation, for surveillance. Her gaze shifted to the table within the chamber, where a map lay spread open, marked with precise notations, routes, names, positions, all arranged with a level of detail that spoke of careful planning, of strategy that extended far beyond the walls of the manor. Beside it rested a pair of binoculars, worn but well maintained, their placement deliberate. And then she felt it, the presence, stronger now, undeniable. She turned slowly, her breath catching as her eyes adjusted to the dim light behind her. He stood in the shadows, not hidden, but not fully revealed either, his figure still, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made the air itself feel heavier. Adrian. For a moment, the world ceased to exist. Her mind refused to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew to be true. Her breath shallow, her thoughts scattered between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. "You are dead," she whispered, the words barely forming as they left her lips. He did not move immediately, did not rush forward, did not close the distance between them, because this moment, this fragile, impossible moment, required something far more careful than instinct. "Not to them," he replied quietly, his voice the same, steady, grounded, yet carrying a weight she had never heard before. The sound of it shattered whatever restraint she had left, her composure breaking as she took a step toward him, then another, until she stood close enough to see him clearly. He was changed, not in the ways that mattered most, not in the essence of who he was, but in the details, the edges. His face bore faint scars that had not been there before. His clothes were worn, practical. His presence carrying a tension that spoke of constant vigilance, of a man who had not rested, who had not stopped moving since the moment the world believed him gone. "You let me mourn you," she said, her voice trembling now, the pain of it rising sharply to the surface. "You let me believe you were gone." His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible crack in the control he maintained. "I had to," he said, the words quiet but unyielding, "because if I lived in their eyes, you would not." The truth settled heavily between them, its implications immediate and unforgiving. "Voss," she said, the name forming with sudden clarity. Adrian nodded once. He orchestrated the attack. The carriage, the bridge, the timing. It was never meant to kill me. It was meant to remove me and leave you exposed. Lyra's breath caught, the pieces falling into place with terrifying precision. "And you disappeared." "I died," he corrected, his gaze unwavering, his voice carrying the weight of the choice he had made, "because from the shadows, I can see what I could not from the throne. I can move without being seen. I can hunt them before they strike again." His gaze softened then, just slightly, the edge of the strategist giving way to something far more personal. "And I can protect you in ways they will never anticipate." The room fell silent once more, But this time, it was not empty. It was full of truth, of realization, of everything that had been hidden now laid bare. Lyra looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time since his death, she understood. He had not abandoned her. He had sacrificed himself. Not his life, but his place in it. And in doing so, he had become something far more dangerous than the Duke the kingdom once knew. He had become a shadow, and the shadows were where he ruled best. The chapel of High Seat Manor had always been a place of quiet reflection, its vaulted ceilings arching high above polished stone floors, its stained glass windows casting fractured light across the room in soft hues of gold and crimson. But on this night, that light felt colder, sharper, as though even the sacred space understood that something was about to be broken within its walls. Lyra stood near the altar, her black veil no longer drawn across her face, her posture steady despite the storm of emotion that churned beneath the surface, because grief had changed her, had hardened something within her that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. She was no longer the woman who had waited for protection. She was the one standing at the center of it. The doors behind her opened with a slow, deliberate creak, and she did not turn immediately because she already knew who it was. Baron Voss stepped inside with the same careful composure he had worn since his arrival, his movements measured, his expression arranged into something that resembled concern, though the illusion had long since begun to crack. "You sent for me, my lady," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, the tone of a man who believed himself already in command of the outcome. Lyra turned then, her gaze meeting his directly, no longer softened by grief or uncertainty, but sharpened by understanding. "You wanted me alone," she replied, her voice calm, steady, carrying a quiet authority that had not been there before. "So here I am." Voss studied her for a moment, something flickering behind his eyes, not surprise, but calculation, as though adjusting his expectations in real time. "Then let us not waste the opportunity," he said, stepping further into the chapel, the echo of his boots against stone unnaturally loud in the stillness. From within his coat, he withdrew a document, unfolding it with deliberate care before placing it upon the altar between them. "A transfer of command," he explained, his tone almost casual, as though the matter were a simple formality. "The estate's military authority, the guard, the towers, all placed under my control. Temporarily, of course, until you are better suited to make such decisions." Lyra did not move to look at the document, her attention fixed entirely on him. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. Voss's expression did not change immediately, but something beneath it shifted, something darker, something that had been carefully concealed now beginning to surface. "Then I would be forced to question your stability," he replied, his voice still smooth, though the edges of it had sharpened slightly. "A grieving widow making irrational choices. It would not be difficult to convince the council that you require guidance." The implication was clear. He did not need her consent, only her silence. "You planned this from the beginning," Lyra said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded against her ribs, not with fear, but with the certainty of what she now faced. The letters, the attack, Adrian's death. Voss smiled then, and this time it reached his eyes, not with warmth, but with something cold and venomous. "You give me too much credit," he said lightly, though his gaze did not waver. "Your husband made many enemies. I simply ensured that one of them succeeded." The words hung in the air, their cruelty undeniable, their truth even more so. You tried to kill him, Lyra said, her voice quieter now, the weight of it settling fully into place. I tried to remove him, Voss corrected, his tone almost amused, because as long as he stood, I would always be second, always lesser, and I am not a man who accepts such a position. He stepped closer then, the distance between them closing, his presence no longer masked by pretense. Sign it, he said, his voice dropping the last remnants of civility, or I will finish what I started. Lyra did not step back, did not flinch, because she knew something he did not. You should have made sure he was truly dead, she said softly. The words barely left her lips before the air in the chapel changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the shadows that clung to the corners of the room, a movement that did not belong to light or wind, but something else entirely. Voss noticed it a second too late. The darkness behind him seemed to deepen, to gather, to take shape, and from it, Adrian stepped forward. Not the Duke as he had been known, not the polished war hero clad in authority and command, but something far more dangerous. His presence was raw, unrefined, stripped of all pretense, his movements silent, precise, his eyes carrying a lethal focus that spoke of weeks spent in the shadows, watching, waiting, preparing. Voss turned sharply, his composure fracturing for the first time, as recognition struck him. Impossible, he breathed, the word slipping out before he could stop it. Adrian did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on his brother with a calm that was far more terrifying than anger could have been. You always underestimated me, he said finally, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight that filled the entire space. You thought removing me from the board would end the game? Voss's shock twisted quickly into something else, something desperate, something violent. Guards! He called out, his voice sharp, breaking through the silence, but no one came. Because they were already here. The doors of the chapel opened once more, not slowly this time, but with force, and the loyal household guard stepped inside, their presence filling the space, their allegiance clear. They had been waiting, watching, just as Adrian had. It was over before it truly began. Voss's attempts to regain control collapsed under the weight of truth laid bare. His composure shattered completely as he was seized, his protests sharp, frantic, stripped of the careful control he had maintained for so long. You cannot do this, he spat, his voice filled with fury as he struggled against the grip that held him. I am your brother. Adrian's expression did not change. You were, he replied, his tone final, absolute, and then he turned away, because Voss no longer mattered. The real battle had never been with him. It had been here, with her. The guards dragged Voss from the chapel, his voice fading into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any noise could have been. And in that silence, Adrian and Lyra stood facing one another, the truth between them no longer hidden, no longer deferred. For a moment, neither of them moved, because what came next was not strategy, not war, but something far more complicated. You lied to me, Lyra said finally, her voice steady, though the emotion beneath it was unmistakable. Adrian did not deny it. Yes, he said simply. You let me believe you were dead. Yes. The answers were direct, unguarded, leaving no room for deflection, no attempt to soften what had been done. She took a step closer then, her gaze searching his, not for the man he had been, but for the truth of who he was now. Do you understand what that did to me? She asked, her voice breaking just slightly despite her control. Adrian's jaw tightened, the weight of it evident in the way he held himself. I do, he said quietly, and I would do it again. The words struck harder than anything else he could have said, their honesty cutting through everything that remained unspoken. Because it was not a justification. It was a truth. To save you, he continued, his voice low, unwavering. I had to become something you could hate. Lyra held his gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, filled with everything that had been lost, everything that had been risked, everything that still remained. And then, slowly, she reached up, her fingers brushing against his face, tracing the faint scars that marked what he had endured in the shadows. You were never something I could hate, she said softly. The words settled into him in a way nothing else had, breaking through the last of the distance he had placed between them. The vigil was over. The shadows had done their work. And what remained was not the Duke and the Duchess as they had been before, but something stronger, something forged in truth rather than illusion. A bond not untouched by darkness, but defined by the choice to face it together. The manor did not return to what it had been before, because some things, once broken, could not simply be restored to their original shape, and perhaps they were never meant to be. In the days that followed Baron Voss's arrest, the estate moved with a quiet intensity, not chaotic, not uncertain, but purposeful, as though every stone, every corridor, from every watchtower understood that the balance of power had shifted and would not be shifting back. The loyal guard, those who had remained unseen and silent during Adrian's absence, stepped fully into the light once more, reclaiming their positions with a discipline that left no room for doubt about where their allegiance lay. Word spread quickly beyond the estate walls, carried through whispers at first, then through official decree, that the Duke of High Seat was not dead, that the tragedy at the Blackwater River had been a deception, and that the man who had orchestrated it had been none other than his own brother. The revelation struck the kingdom with a force that rippled through court and countryside alike, not just because of the betrayal, but because of what it revealed about the man they thought they knew. And Adrian was no longer just the war hero who had defended their borders. He was something more calculated, more dangerous, a man willing to sacrifice his own name, his own life in the eyes of the world, to protect what mattered most. And at the center of it all stood Lyra. She moved through the estate differently now, no longer shadowed by uncertainty or defined by grief, but anchored by something stronger, something forged in the fire of truth. The black veil was gone, set aside not as a rejection of what she had endured, but as a quiet acknowledgement that she had survived it. The people began to see her not as the grieving widow, but as something else entirely. The Duchess who had stood in the face of betrayal and did not break. And Adrian did not step fully back into the light, not immediately. Though the world now knew he lived, he remained, in many ways, a creature of the shadows he had embraced, moving through the unseen spaces of the estate with the same quiet precision, the same watchful presence that had kept Lyra safe when she did not even know she was being protected. Because the truth was, the threats had not vanished with Voss. They had only been revealed. And Adrian was not a man who waited for danger to arrive. He ensured it never had the chance. It was Lyra who found him one evening, standing within the hidden chamber above the great hall, the same place where she had first seen him after the world believed him gone. He did not turn immediately when she entered, his attention fixed on the space below, on the movement of guards, the rhythm of the estate, as though he were still mapping it, still measuring it, still preparing for something unseen. "Ah, you are still watching," she said softly. Adrian exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the quiet of the room. "It is what kept you alive," he replied. She stepped closer, her presence no longer something he needed to guard against, but something he allowed himself to feel fully, completely. "You do not have to carry it alone anymore," she said, her voice steady, certain. He turned then, his gaze meeting hers, and for a moment, the weight he carried was visible, not in weakness, but in the simple truth of what it had cost him to become what he had needed to be. "I never did," he said quietly. "Not really." The words settled between them, and Lyra reached for the locket at her neck, the one he had given her on that final night before everything changed. She opened it slowly, revealing the hidden compartment within, still empty, still waiting. "You told me to look for the light within," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "I think I understand now." Adrian's gaze softened, just slightly, the edge of the shadow giving way to something warmer, something that had never truly disappeared, only been buried beneath necessity. "And what did you find?" he asked. Lyra stepped closer, closing the distance between them completely, her hand lifting to rest over his, guiding it gently toward the locket. "Not something," she said softly. "Someone." The meaning was clear, undeniable, and for the first time since he had chosen the path that led him into darkness, Adrian allowed himself to step out of it, not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to stand beside her not as the shadow that protected her, but as the man who loved her. The kingdom would remember the betrayal. It would remember the deception. It would remember the night the Duke of High Seat returned from the dead. But what it would not fully understand, what it could never truly see, was the quiet truth that lived beneath it all. That to save the heart of the kingdom, he had broken his own, and in doing so, he had not lost it. He had simply placed it somewhere safer, in the one place it had always belonged, with her.